Michelle and Mike, thanks again. So our penultimate panel promises to be a good one, and it'll set the stage for our grand finale. Before that finale, Todd Veazie will facilitate a group discussion on 9/11 lessons learned, and he'll be joined by Gina Bennett, a U.S. intelligence analyst and senior advisor to the National Counterterrorism Center, Candace Rondeaux, senior fellow and professor of practice at the Center for the Future of War, Vice Admiral Stuart Munsch, Director of Joint Force Development for the Joint Chiefs and author of the Joint Warfighting Concept, and Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross, former senior advisor to the Director of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office of Community Partnerships. Todd, over to you.
Good afternoon, all. It's an honor to be asked to moderate this panel. On a day that began with presentations from names like Grinkovich, Clark, Petraeus, McMaster, O'Hanlon, Chalufo, and Flournoy, our task to keep you engaged is a mighty one indeed, but I believe our panel is up to the test. Yesterday, we heard from leaders who were in the room and on the field when key decisions and judgments were made in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Today, leaders have described the strategic response to the attacks in detail and began a dialogue on the longer term, focusing on the ensuing global war on terrorism and the lessons the U.S. and our allies learned during those eventful years, not just in the Middle East, but on our country's competition with near-peer nation states like Russia and China and their proxies. 20 years is a long lens for introspection and learning, but only if we embrace the opportunity to take stock. We have an obligation to do so, not as an exercise in self-flagellation, but in part to solemnly recompense all that has been lost and sacrificed over the last 20 years and to find new footing. It is certainly a journey and not a destination. In that pursuit, our panel will offer a convergence and pivot from commemoration, remembrance, and reflection to introspection and projection to find wisdom from earned experience. Our panel will take the historic sweep of the GWOT and its paradigmatic shifts and transformations within the joint force and broader national security establishment and attempt to assess how it positions us for emerging and future challenges, notably strategic competition. The military and national security paradigm and structure born of the Cold War that was standing on the 10th of September in 2001 was utterly transformed over the 20 years since those attacks. What lessons should we have learned and carried forward, and which should be discarded? We will not have live inputs today from the audience, so I took the liberty of crowdsourcing some questions in advance to stimulate the conversation. In terms of time management, I wanted to privilege discussion over presentation by asking the panelists to provide short framing remarks before moving straight to Q&A, so let's begin. Our first panelist is Vice Admiral Stuart Munsch, a native of North Dakota who comes to us through the Naval Academy, Oxford University, where he's a Rhodes Scholar, and through a long line of operational submarine tours and senior operational fleet leadership assignments. There's a tipping point in every submarine officer's career where they have more accumulated time above the ocean than beneath it. Vice Admiral Munsch may finally reach that milestone in his present service as the Director for Operational Plans and Joint Force Development on the Joint Staff, what we refer to as the J7. It is here that in the J7 that Vice Admiral Munsch and his team apply the skills that are part historian and part futurist to do the big thinking about the U.S. military's future warfare concepts and the development of a force to meet that need. Vice Admiral Munsch.
Thank you, Todd, and good afternoon, everyone. I thought I would just remark at the beginning about my 9/11 experience. I had just finished my year as a White House Fellow. We wrapped up on August 31st. And our international trip that year went to India and Pakistan. And in Pakistan, went to Peshawar and up to the Afghan border. Little did I know 11 days later how important that would be to have seen that firsthand. And so just as a personal lesson, I think traveling the world, getting to know things through firsthand experience gives you a much richer understanding of what we might be headed into. And so I would encourage everybody to take that opportunity if you can do so. My perspective in this panel is largely from the military perspective and looking forward. So I thought I would pull three things from the experience of the last couple decades and project forward on that. My first main point is that it's incredibly important that we focus on the character of the interaction between us and the potential adversary. As simple as that sounds, think through our past conflicts and how long we might have fought until we finally hit upon what was the nature of the interaction between us and the adversary. Where were the strengths? Where were the weaknesses? And thereby, where should we put emphasis to press our case, and emphasis to block what the adversary was doing? That requires an understanding of the adversary's culture. I think we saw that quite significantly over the last couple decades, how long that took us to learn the culture there in the Middle East. We've got a new challenge coming ahead with China, and just like with the language barrier that existed with the cultures in the Middle East, we'll have a similar thing with respect to China. But we've got to come to understand how they think, how they operate, how they will interact with us. And then the second item I would say is that something that we went through that's instructive is that we essentially had a collapse of our strategic structures within parts of the armed forces. For example, in the Navy, they disbanded the office that was responsible for the strategic thinking of the Navy. The thinking was, well, that's the Joint Staff's job. But once you do that and you break apart that cadre of people that creates that conveyor belt of thinkers going into the future, it's really hard to rebuild that. Another indication of that loss of strategic level thinking is what we did with logistics. We went into Lean Six Sigma just-in-time delivery and assuming an uncontested environment. And we dismantled a tremendous amount of the logistics capability in the armed forces to fight and distribute in a contested environment. If you go back a little bit further in our history and go over to Fort McNair, you see that there are two main colleges there. One is focused on warfighting, the other one's focused on logistics. So clearly our predecessors had learned that lesson and wanted to perpetuate the importance of that. And it's not only logistics that we came to assume as uncontested, but it's also most of the domains. And we fought what was a relatively narrow form of warfare, where the ground certainly was contested, on occasion the air, but certainly not the maritime and not in space, and maybe just a little bit in cyber. And so here again are strategic structures that we need to rebuild. The broader lesson might be there to not completely dismantle in the presence of a different threat what you had built for a prior threat, but to hold on to the core of it. So we had learned quite a bit about counterinsurgency in Vietnam, and much of that was let go, and we had to relearn that. So similarly here, while we're rebuilding the strategic structures, we should not let go of what we've learned in counterinsurgency. My third main point would be Homeland Defense. We got a pretty sharp lesson on 9/11, how quickly the character of Homeland Defense can change. And we've got to be conscious here to not just think of the threat that we would want, but the threat the way it is. And there are plenty of precursors there as to what that threat was going to be like, including the very specifics of using commercial airline aircraft to hit important targets. We've got the same signals now, but I don't see all of us turning to, again, acknowledge the threat the way it is, and instead are trying to acknowledge the threat we would like it to be when it comes to Homeland Defense. So Homeland Defense is not like it was in the Cold War, where it was intercontinental ballistic missiles, intercontinental bombers were largely the threat. It's those things still, but it's also hypersonic glide vehicles of various forms that can act on very short notice and are able to fly through a number of different azimuths in approaching the homeland. It's also cyber and its ability to reach out virtually anywhere in the United States with the ability to do so almost instantaneously. It's also obviously biowarfare, given our experience here with COVID. And it's also an experience where we have a large population from a potential adversary that lives and is educated in the United States. So we've got to be cognizant here of the true character of Homeland Defense and what we need to face up to here. It's not like the Cold War. It's not like it's been the last 20 years. It's going to be different. And on that point about a large number of students from a potential adversary being educated in our country, that takes me back to our first point, understanding the nature of the interaction between us and them. Who has the advantage there? Back to you, Todd.
Thank you, Admiral. Our next panelist is Gina Bennett. Gina is well known to many in this audience, serving over 3 decades in the Central Intelligence Agency. She is a plank owner in their senior analytics service and one of the foremost counterterrorism experts in the U.S. government. Her body of work is legendary and includes the 1993 report that warned of the growing danger of Osama bin Laden and the extremist movement he was fomenting. Her analysis has been described as prescient, genius, and prophetic by major media and former government officials. And as someone who has had the honor of serving with Gina, I can attest that it is absolutely true. Gina is the author of 2 books, National Security Mom and National Security Mom 2, America Needs a Timeout, in which she makes a convincing case that the guiding principles learned as a single mom raising 5 kids can be effectively applied to the ship of state. We should listen to her. Gina?
Thank you, Todd. Much too generous, as always, in your praise, but I appreciate it. I want to also say thank you to my co-panelists and for the opportunity to be here today. I have to say, I teach ethics and intelligence and national security at Georgetown. And last evening I had, my weekly class. And I was thinking about this panel as I was with my students and just so proud to be a part of a government, a government that deliberately embraces learning, that has the willingness to face the past, face its own choices, and try to learn as much as it can from it. And so I am really appreciative of being here today. So thank you. I would also like to frame my remarks. This wasn't coordinated, but from the perspective of really, for me, experiencing 9/11, in the Counterterrorist Center at CIA that particular day, already having worked on the problem for 10 years of Al-Qaeda and the growing jihadist movement. And some of the immediate lessons that I learned in that day and in the following days. So, because I think they're still incredibly relevant. The first of which, oddly enough, is inspired by the weather. The weather that day on the East Coast, and particularly in Washington, D.C., was unbelievably gorgeous. It was a beautiful, crisp, crystal blue sky. We don't have those a lot in the swamp of D.C., so it was just one of those striking things. And it's interesting because I've talked to folks who also remember 9/11 all the way up the Eastern Seaboard. They start off with that same thought. The weather was just beautiful that day. And the reason I bring it up is not to be flippant, but because the day didn't turn out to be a beautiful day. It was a horrific day for everyone. And yet I think 20 years later, when I talk to anyone in this area about 9/11, it's one of the first things that we all share is how gorgeous that day was. I think it's a powerful reminder of how much you're not in control. You're reminding us to be humble and recognize that surprise is in fact part of life. So why is that important? Not only for 9/11, but for the years afterwards and in the future. There is no conceivable way to eliminate surprise from human existence. And the fact that we do everything we can, of course, to project what the future might hold, to understand the various different pathways, to game it out, to critically think, to question, that's wonderful. And we will continue to do that, embrace that challenge. But at the end of the day, to raise the expectation that we can eliminate all surprise, whether strategic or tactical, is to raise a false expectation and lead us down a path of blaming each other rather than our adversaries for being hurt, being threatened, being attacked. And that in and of itself just adds to the adversary's narrative about us. And just as Abraham Lincoln said, it's only ourselves that can hurt ourselves. So I think it's really important to consider surprise is always going to be with us, whether it's terrorism or cyber attacks, whatever it's going to be. It's part of national security. It's part of the human existence. And the question then becomes, what do you do with it when it happens? How do you account for it, and who do you hold accountable for it? And hopefully the enemy is the first person you hold accountable. The second thing, the second sort of framing lesson that I would like to offer for me also occurred the day of 9/11. It was a little bit later after the South Tower fell. And I'm not even sure at what point this occurred in the chaos of the morning, but like so many other government buildings that day, we were ordered to evacuate at the CIA, with the exception, of course, of the Counterterrorist Center. The Counterterrorist Center knew it had to stay and do its job. Of course, Al-Qaeda had in its many plots considered the CIA headquarters a target for an aerial attack. So it did cross everybody's mind that was a possibility for the fourth plane or for something else that day. I mean, none of us had the luxury of thinking 9/11 was going to stop on 9/11. There are many reasons for us to believe this was the opening salvo of what would be a series of attacks going on for days, weeks, months, years. But at some point during the day, as our building was being emptied, the Counterterrorist Center, there weren't really very many of us. There were only a couple dozen analysts that day to begin with. We met with our leadership, and our leadership told us, look, we have a job to do. We're going to do our job. We don't have to leave. And everyone was grateful, and we all ran back to our desks to continue doing what we had to do, which was, of course, figure out what was coming next and to be able to prove the attribution of what had just happened. But it was right around then, as my colleagues from other parts of the agency were streaming out of the building, checking on children who were being let out of school and doing all the things that you would probably want to do in that sort of situation. They started streaming in down to the CTC, to the Counterterrorist Center, to volunteer. So there you have this unbelievable, again, it's one of those powerful moments that sticks with me. They could have gone, they could have left, they could have done a million other things that day, but they chose to come help us. They chose to come to the basement, the lowest possible place in the building and help. And I think for me, the lesson there is it's twofold, because on the one hand, I know as a CIA body, I can always count on CIA, our people. That's just who we are. We help each other that way without question. But the other thing is recognizing too how important it is to ask for help and build partnerships, building coalitions. We certainly have seen that in the years after 9/11. If we had had the coalitions of partners and shared sense of purpose when it came to counterterrorism in the years running up to 9/11, I don't know that 9/11 would have happened. I'm not even sure Al-Qaeda would have happened. So I am so grateful. And I think it's an important thing to, as we face the challenges in the future, to realize that we have these incredible coalitions and partnerships that we never would have had before. And not just in terms of other governments, but communities and the private sectors across the world as well. So you can't go it alone. That would be my second framing thought for lessons learned. And then finally, as Todd pointed out, I am unapologetically a mother and a parent, and my understanding of national security is far more really solidified by that way of thinking than anything else. I'm extraordinarily patient. Sometimes I call myself a patient Jeffersonian when it comes to foreign policy, but in so many ways, 5 children, they have taught me that I can only influence but so much and for so long. That ultimately, if we don't create a shared sense of value and intent, then they're going to go their way and I'm going to go my way, and my ability to influence is gone. It's a limited period of time. But the flip side of that is, if you wait and you let them get past those horrific toddler and teenage years, because now I have adult children, they come back and really surprise you as independent people. So I am very proud of my kids, and I just love the people that they have become as adults. So what I have learned from that is the patience for our foreign policy and our national security policies to bear fruit. It may not happen in our lifetime. I mean, look, half the population of this country did not get to vote for 131 years after the Constitution. So it doesn't necessarily happen in our lifetime. But what I learned a few days after 9/11, which was really my first memory of being outside of work. I'm sure I went home at some point, but I don't remember it. I was also pregnant again. 9/11, I was pregnant with my fourth child. And so I remember on Saturday morning, very early in the morning, being at my 11-year-old son's baseball game. And I was standing off to the sidelines in sweats. I probably hadn't showered in many days. I'm sure I wasn't looking good or smelling good at the time. And I knew better than to sit in the stands where I might just fall over from exhaustion. So I stood off to the side. And from the side next to the dugout, I had a great view as the 20 boys were lining up on their baselines to stand at attention for the national anthem, which they did. And then afterwards, one of the managers of the team said, let's have a moment of silence for the tragedy and trauma of Tuesday. Now, I don't know that the 11-year-old boys all knew what he was talking about, but of course, everybody else around the field and in the stands did. And in that moment, I realized how we'd all experienced 9/11. It wasn't just those of us who were in the bowels of CIA and the national security apparatus. And it really struck me. It was such a hard thing to realize. But within a minute, because it was only a minute, you could hold those guys still. A minute later, when the moment of silence was up, they all ran to their dugouts, grabbed their gear, and started, out into the field practicing sliding into first and catching their big catches, and just as only 11-year-old little boys playing baseball can, living life large. And it was also in that moment that I realized that we were going to be okay, that America is going to be okay. It was such a powerful hit, it just hit me. And I've really never panicked since then. So what that comes down to is resilience, right? I mean, if we don't let someone change us, whether it's a terrorist or another adversary, then we don't change. It's really all up to us. And having that resilience is something that's not just in the federal government or the national security or intelligence community, it's every single American. So it's within all of our power to be a part of our own success. And that, to me, I think is really important, moving forward as well, is to remember the role of the very powerful American citizen in our own national security. So I will end with those three ideas. And again, thank you for inviting me to be here today.
The International Herald Tribune once described Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross as a rising star in the counterterrorism community. And while that may have been true in 2003 or whenever it was written, it is grossly understated to his rise over the past 20 years. David is the expert that the experts call to discuss the nettlesome challenges with terrorism and counterterrorism. I was humbly and gratefully one of them. I was profoundly drawn to his 2011 book, Bin Laden's Legacy, Why We Are Still Losing the War on Terror, that applied a powerful net assessment analytic approach to show the strategic mismatch in the United States response to al-Qaeda's strategy, and most importantly, how to shift to a more proactive and constructive posture. David is the founder and CEO of Valens Global, a company with David's DNA all over it, that thrives on solving hard problems for clients across the U.S. government and beyond. David?
Thank you, Todd, for that great introduction. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel with some, really excellent panelists. I enjoyed very much listening to the two opening remarks that preceded mine. I was struck in listening to Gina's just how what I'm saying and what she said will seem at odds, but I think that it's actually just two different sides of the same coin. So I'm glad you began with Bin Laden's legacy. This is a book I published, 10 years ago. It came out just around the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and I think that very little else that I've written has been met with such skepticism. If you look at where we were in 2011, you had the Arab Spring revolutions, which, by September, I think the US intelligence community was no longer optimistic that this was the death knell for jihadism, but certainly the public sphere still fervently held that to be the case. Bin Laden, of course, had been killed on the very beginning of May of that year. And so this prevailing view existed that we were done, that the war on terror was won. And I remember the few interviews I had about the book at the time, being invited to radio stations, then saying the title of the book and then saying, okay, so why are we still losing? This was 10 years ago, right? Obviously, we flash forward 10 years and we're in this prevailing mood of pessimism. And I don't want to belabor that mood of pessimism other than to say that I feel like we're 10 years behind in terms of public mood. I feel like the lessons of the past 10 years are very different than the lessons of 2001 to 2011. That's not saying that we've adjusted in terms of all errors, but that to me, GWAT as such has been done for a while. I don't think we've actually been fighting a global war on terror, in my opinion, since the summer of 2010. Some might date it differently, but we clearly have had a shift in strategic priorities. And I think that a lot of the public commentary I look at now in 2021 is sort of harping on the lessons that people should have gotten by 2011. I think there's a new set of lessons that really is largely untapped. I wanted to try to distill mine down to two. And the first lesson is accountability. In my own opinion, and just all of us bring our own lenses into this. Let me kind of emphasize that mine is as a subject matter expert and a scholar and an author. I will frequently do work for government or within government, but fundamentally I'm just on the outskirts of government. And as such, a lot of what I am looking at is how government interacts with the subject matter expert sphere or with contractors or academics. How ultimately does government draw on the resources that our nation has to offer? And the first lesson, as I said, it's accountability. I think that Gina is fundamentally right that we should be viewing the enemy as the enemy and not one another. We should be looking at the enemy when there is strategic surprise as to pointing fingers. Unfortunately, as we all know, that's not what happens typically. Like the 20th anniversary of 9/11 was an orgy of finger pointing in multiple directions with everyone telling you that they had the answers all along. I think if we were all a little bit more modest, it would be easier to be on the same team. Absent modesty, we need accountability. Observationally for me, the most devastating hits that my career has taken have always been areas where I've been right about something that the field doesn't believe to be true. That was true, I would say, in 2011. I think I was right about the Arab Spring from the outset, which has not been the death knell for jihadism. I think if you look at my career took a lot of hits during the Al-Qaeda-ISIS competition, in part by disagreeing that ISIS was completely displacing the Al-Qaeda network. It's 2021. We can see that it hasn't. What I would say is it's worth thinking about what are people's incentives to disagree with the herd, taking whatever that entails, whether it's mockery or kind of loss of status or professional hits, because we want to encourage people to think differently than anybody else. And that's harder. To some extent, that gets harder and harder over time in the age of social media and all of us always knowing what everyone in the world thinks of us. But we have to encourage that outside the box thinking, especially because the subject matter we're dealing with is complex. Nobody has a perfect record. But ultimately, if we're going to get better ideas, there has to be incentive for them. The second thing is, how do you empower good strategy? This is one of the questions that I looked into when I was writing Bin Laden's Legacy a decade ago, and didn't even write it up in the book, because I found that nobody I talked to had an answer, even when looking within their own niche of the government or their niche of the private sector. The question of how do you empower good strategy is such a complex one. And what I found in conducting numerous interviews for that book was that people in positions that seem to be empowered feel disempowered more often than not. Now, I guess the area where I would kind of take that forward a bit and provide a little bit more of an optimistic take, because I think it's good to end with optimism, especially if we're taking lessons learned and projecting them forward. In part, the experiences I've had with kind of what I feel is a lack of accountability analytically and kind of a lack of strategic empowerment led me to founding Valens Global. It led me to an appreciation of just how important organizational design is. A book I have coming out next year, which Columbia University Press will be publishing, is looking at how jihadist groups engage in organizational learning. And Gina started by saying that we have a government that embraces learning. And I agree that that is definitely the case compared to most governments. It is definitely not the case compared to what I would like. And so I think that the question of how can we make things better, ultimately, it should be a cooperative question. I guess in practice, it often isn't that. It often becomes a highly adversarial question. With Valens, I've been very pleased to see what I can do, making tweaks to organizational structure. And it leads me to how within the government as a whole and the sphere that the government touches, there's ways to instill better learning, better strategy, better accountability. And to me, if that's the lesson that we can take of the past 20 years and bring it into not just the continuing fight against terrorism, but into great power competition, then there's a lot that we can draw on there that will be profound and that will help our nation. Thanks.
Dr. Candace Rondeaux leads New America's Future Frontlines that confronts the state-centric security paradigm head-on by seeking new understandings and solutions to apex challenges that increasingly force us to reimagine notions of sovereignty, borders, resilience, and sustainability through digital tools and journalistic techniques. She is a professor of practice and fellow at the Melkin Center for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies, and the Center for the Future of War at Arizona State University. Her work on political violence and violent extremism is exemplified by her time serving at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she launched the Resolve Network, a global research consortium on conflict and violent extremism, and is a strategic advisor to the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Candace.
Thank you, Todd. I'm so honored to be here to talk to this illustrious group of participants in this conference. So many names that I have reported on, recognized, been cheek by jowl with for so many years. And of course, the panelists in this conversation outdo me in many ways. Important to note that I'm not really a doctor. I just pretend to be one on TV. I'm just a professor of practice who happens to have a little bit of experience teaching and learning. I also want to kind of start out with some context about my own sort of 9/11 experience, all kind of in the mode. I actually had a job in the North Tower that I quit 2 weeks before the towers fell. I was a junior journalist, cub reporter. I was just finishing my last semester of grad school at NYU, and I actually quit that job so that I could go work at the New York Daily News for the investigative team and the Metro team. And so my second day on the job was 9/11 in New York. And it was, as for many of us here and on the conference, the beginning of a long, long journey to understanding the challenges that we have with grand strategy when surprise takes the wind out of us, to Gina's point. I have so many different lessons, primarily from the war on terror and Afghanistan in specific, that I would love to share, but I think it would take, hours. And I actually teach a course on that that takes actually 7 weeks. So I won't do that here. I'm just going to maybe touch on a few major takeaways that I think will be important for thinking about the future of great power competition when we are talking about China and Russia. At the end of the day, we've been talking a lot about kind of the legacies and the lessons of regime change wars. But we have to think about whether or not now we're looking at behavior change wars differently, right? The expectation for China, for Russia is, our goal would be behavior change. But there may be a great temptation to think that behavior change is axiomatic with regime change. And we have to be really careful that we don't wander down that path yet again. So that's one of the big takeaways. But just from a kind of field and inside the wire perspective, some grand lessons in the area of ways versus ways, means, and ends. The ways in which the United States today, and even 20 years ago, pursues overseas contingency operations are challenged in a number of different areas. The first being is very difficult under the 1947 National Security Act to maintain continuity of policy from one administration to the next. And we still don't have the hinge pin between the Office of Management and Budget and the White House and Congress that is needed in order to ensure that off-book spending doesn't become a runaway train and that skews our strategic intent and skews our strategic outcomes. That's one big lesson in the ways category. A second lesson in the ways category, coalition warfare is hard. We know this, and I think we probably have heard this from some of our other conference participants. It is even harder when you have several different nations with very different ideas about the nature of the use of military force, when it can be applied, and what the rules of engagement can be in a given theater, which is one of the biggest challenges in Afghanistan, and less so obviously in Iraq, since there were lesser coalition members there. It is also hard to have coalition warfare move forward successfully when you don't have an agreement at the outset on who is going to be in charge of the coalition, and to state that up front and clearly. In the means category, there was an awful lot of spending on reconstruction efforts, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have done that in other conflict zones or fragile states around the world over the last 20 years. I think to mixed effects, and certainly we can certainly say that there's a big contrast between the outcomes in Iraq versus Afghanistan that is right in front of us. One of the questions this raises is, have we learned any strong lessons about the absorptive capacity of fragile states that have been at war, sometimes for decades at a time? The reality is that absorptive capacity for large-scale inflows of US dollars is just not there, and you have to anticipate the distorting effect that will have on the environment, on the theater. In the further in the means category, just quickly on governance, there was an enormous amount of expenditure of political will, capital on this idea of good governance through electoral politics. Electoral politics requires a few things. To enfranchise people with a vote, you also have to count them. And one of the things we did not do, or did not emphasize, or did not make a conditionality, either in Iraq or Afghanistan, was just the simple fact of a census. No other country in the world would expect that you would be able to deliver government services, whether in a box or not, without being able to figure out how those services and goods were distributed amongst the population. So forget human terrain, just do a census. Last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about ends and why they were so hard to reach. One reason is because I think the United States really struggled to hear and listen and digest the messages behind the rhetoric that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda promoted. A key message throughout, and still to this day, and from the beginning, even before the attacks of 9/11, was the United States supports corrupt, abusive regimes, and it will do anything to advance its interests at the cost of human lives. We didn't listen to it as much as we could have, and therefore we could not respond to it. We couldn't message appropriately or act appropriately in response to that criticism. But that rhetoric was so loud on so many different channels, in so many different languages, that it overwhelmed our strategic capacity to be responsive. So, big lesson, think hard about strategic communications, think hard about intelligence collection, not just for kinetic action, but also for understanding the milieu that you find yourself in. Last, but not at all least, is the question of how we think about nation-to-nation conflict in this new environment where information is so central to shaping perceptions. The United States has a serious challenge in this area for a number of reasons, but not just governmental. Many of the challenges the United States faces in terms of shaping perceptions will come in the form of accelerated narratives through the use of artificial intelligence, escalated, the risk of escalation of conflict simply because the rapidity and the overwhelming sheer massiveness of information flows will overwhelm our ability to really think through carefully the problems that we have. Much of that can be solved with just a little bit more attention to some of the basics of governance and regulation in our own markets when it comes to tech policy. And I think we're going to see increasingly that the vulnerabilities that the United States has are no different than, say, those that the Afghans face or Ukrainians face just a few years ago or continue to face. The attack surface is us in this future of war. And to reduce that attack surface, we're going to have to be a lot more careful about privacy protections, about the way digital information is managed, and the way we define with both competitors and coalition partners, what are the thresholds for norms and violations of norms in the context of information warfare.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you all. So there was a lot of common themes here, and thank you for that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the value of friends. Sir Lawrence Friedman, who the UK authority on so many things, including strategy, once said to me in a private conversation, I don't think he would at all object to me sharing it now, is that, and I don't know why this struck me as a bit of a surprise, not in the way I'd normally thought, but we've thought about as a nation our military and our economic might, the things that we believe make us a superpower. But he said your true superpower is your friends and your attractiveness and your ability to make friends. He said the Chinese don't have any friends, and even the satellite states of the former Soviet Union generally cannot stand Russia. He said, this is your superpower, in not so many words. And so we've seen a lot of elasticity over the last 5 or 6 years regarding alliances and what they mean and America first, or we go this together. What are your thoughts about the lesson of friendships and alliances, and even if reconceived or reimagined in new ways? And we are seeing that. A reimagined NATO, the D10, these Quad relationships. Thoughts about that going forward? Anyone, please. Gina, you look like you're getting ready to tap the tap the mute.
Oh my goodness. You do you have a camera in this room or something, Todd? That was pretty quick. Oh, the only thing I was going to say, since I mentioned friends from a more personal perspective, I think your statement about that being our true superpower and being able to attract friends, it made me think of, one of the things that you rely on your friends for is to tell you the truth, even when you won't really want to face the truth yourself. And certainly, as a single woman, I get a lot of truth from my friends whenever I try to go out on a date. So I think it's, again, I don't feel like these types of relationships or the dynamics change when you go from 2 people to 2 million people. It's just our perception that they do. But I think if there's a way to, I don't want to say institutionalize, but continually embrace those hard conversations with our friends, that's really important, because the fact that we won't dump a country as a friend because they tell us, hey, we're not happy with you, that's what I think stands the test of time. Friends aren't afraid of you. Friends feel respected by you. And I think that that's one of the most important things as we build our coalitions. Yeah, we're not going to agree on everything. In fact, we may not agree on much, but if we can agree that the things that we do agree upon are going to guide our friendship together, and respect that you're going to take a different path on the issues where we disagree and not see that as undercutting the friendship or competition, I think that, that is really, in my mind, what has stood the test of time, and is a little bit under what you were saying about appeal and attraction. I think it's because it's really goes to Candace's point about behavior.
Thank you. Anyone else thoughts on that?
Todd, yeah, I'll give you a couple of thoughts here. I may be a bit romantic in this, and I admit that up front. But acquaintance from a Middle East country that often is vocal about the United States and their criticism, behind closed doors said to me one time, in the end, the United States will do the right thing. And admitting that, we'll struggle getting there, but we'll be self-critical enough to arrive at the right point. And could I boil that down into what does the U.S. represent? I wonder if it might be hope. And if we were a bit more self-conscious about trying to uphold that image, we might do better on the international stage. And I recognize at the state level, we have reasons for acting in our own self-interests, and that's probably more or less recognized around the world. But I think the real power comes in the personal interaction. And Americans have long-standing had this reputation for being friendly and optimistic, and being an embodiment of that hope. And so things that we've been through the last several years here that fray that American approach on a personal basis are probably something we should be concerned about, because it then aggregates up into us not being seen as that beacon of hope. And again, I say I may be romantic here, but I think there's something to that, and that we've been blessed in many ways, and we ought to stand up to that responsibility and uphold it.
Thank you, Admiral. Candace's point on this master narrative that isn't just from Al Qaeda or the global jihadist movement, but it is our transgression of our own values in our relationships and international affairs that I think have caused the headaches, and it is these other powers now picking up on these same things. On balance, I think we've got a very proud record, but certainly, it is always in our best interest to follow our values and to create the beacon of hope and all those things that you mentioned. So thank you. There was a bit of discussion from all of you, or at least in different forms, about structural change and reform. And I want to think from December 10th, 2001 to kind of the present. And I'll begin this question that was somewhat crowdsourced, but go back to the National Security Act of 1947 that created the bureaucracies, that organized monopolies of discrete instruments of power. Think of defense or the military instrument in the Pentagon, and diplomacy in state, and economic power in Treasury and others. And increasingly, though, nearly all of the hard problems we face today require, if you will, an all-hands-on-deck approach, an orchestration of all these instruments with unity of purpose and command. And it requires the consideration of the forest and the trees. After 9/11, we passed the USA Patriot Act very shortly after 9/11, followed by in 2002, the Homeland Security Act, and then the Intelligence Reform and Prevention Act, the IRTPA, in 2004, together representing the largest federal government reorganization since the National Security Act of 1947. And it was specifically designed to address the post-Cold War threats and challenges. We saw the formation of DHS, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the National Counterterrorism Center, and a real push to expand the necessary interagency collaboration, that all hands on deck, both from information sharing, we heard a lot about that in those early years, required to meet the challenge. But beyond this aim, directly counter the first order effects of terrorism, it seems that the larger goal is to herd our government away from the legacy paradigm of youth soccer, all kids running at the ball, somewhat independently, uncoordinated, something akin, and to try to achieve something more akin to a gestalt where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So my question is, were these reforms enough? Do they meet the challenge of the current era? And as we look forward, do we need a new National Security Act of 2022 that goes further, perhaps a Goldwater Nichols for the interagency, as you recall from the military reforms of the late 2018 or 86? God, dating myself. So thoughts about this? Structural reform. Are we getting this right? Do we need to think differently?
Can I jump in here?
Please.
We've done a lot of thinking about this. I think a lot of folks in this conference have done a lot of thinking about this. I know there's been a lot of writing about this, but I'll just maybe give a few 2 cents from observations after interviewing hundreds of American, European, and Afghan colleagues about their experience, their lessons learned, big time, from the strategic perspective. There is no question that the 1947 National Security Act is insufficient for our challenges today. I think probably most people who are, listening to this and participating in this conversation probably would agree with that on a number of different levels. There are some pretty standout pieces that are missing, just from a perspective of dealing with crisis on a continuum. And one is figuring out how to reconcile the vision that a given executive branch leadership might have with that of Congress. The United States will spend, God knows how many billions and trillions of dollars in the next phases of our, contingency operations, whether it's in the context of something like Afghanistan and Iraq, or it's something where it's a, higher level state-on-state scenario with Russia and China that we cannot yet see. Regardless, money will be spent. The question is, will it be spent wisely? Not how much money, but will it be spent wisely? To do that, there has to be a seat at the table for the Office of Management and Budget. How that glued together is a question, but in some of the research and analysis that I've done in the past, one suggestion that surfaced over and over again was just this idea of creating an OMB position that would be tied to the NSC, but yet would have continuity across administrations to ensure that glue is there, to ensure that there isn't this kind of, logjam with the spending. That's one very big observation. But now we have to ask the question, given what we know about the next, 20 to 30 years in the United States and all over the world, how much adaptation is going to have to take place for this coming climate change catastrophe that we're facing, the energy transition. Is it time, for instance, to put the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, give them a seat at the table on the National Security Council? Is it time to make commerce, because tech is so important, a permanent seat at the table when it comes to the National Security Council? And would that help anything at that, beyond sort of just putting more chairs at the table? I think, I'd be curious to hear from others on this panel if there are other more tactical moves, but I think those are some of the high-level strategic ones.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I agree with Candace that what we have in place is not sufficient to meet the various challenges that we confront. And I'll put a few things on the table here. The first one is just strategic drift. We have increasingly two parties that are just not on the same page. And so the variegations from one administration to the next are right now wild. Now, I don't think that in a democratic country you could necessarily deal with that well, but if I was looking at how do you refine government in such a way that there'll be less strategic drift, how do you refine government in a way to make it look more long-term? I would look systemically at something like perhaps terms should be longer, not senatorial terms, but perhaps presidential terms and House of Representative terms, in part because we have politicians now who essentially are in campaign mode every single day of the year. I don't think that's good for decision making. Secondly, the contracting sphere. I don't think that the government gets the most for its money. Some of the ways that it spends its money would be ridiculous to any of us. I've seen lowest cost technically acceptable bid contracts awarded with a difference of 3 cents between the winning bid and the number 2 bid. None of us in our normal lives say, okay, well, this offer was 3 cents lower, so I'm not going to look at anything else. The federal government does it that way. That just doesn't provide any of the right incentives. Third, I think that civil service reform, it's something that every president tries. None of them succeed. I think it would be an important step to take. The federal government does not have great control, great ability to control its workforce. Now, there are exceptions, right? There are some federal agencies which I think are much better than others in terms of being able to be meritocratic, but I think we have systemic problems in that regard. A fourth thing, and to get to my last 3 points are, I think, the most in line with the challenges we confront in the 21st century. My fourth point is we need to consider a system of startups within government. 90% of startups fail within 3 years, but those that succeed often succeed wildly. I think government is used to a system where most offices muddle through. And again, there are exceptions to this. I don't want to draw with too broad a brush, but I'd like to see more of a startups within government model with very clear metrics for success and failure, and more offices being rolled up because while others are able to succeed in ways that need to be agile. For a startups within government model, you also need to be able to selectively debureaucratize. Theoretically, Global Engagement Center should be that. It's a theoretical startup within government. I think JSOC is arguably an actual startup within government. But talking to people at GEC over the years, they're always frustrated with the tremendous amount of bureaucracy it takes even to post a single tweet. That brings me to the final 2 points, the first of which is in the technology space, we have this very interesting dynamic where Silicon Valley is clearly very suspicious of working with the US government. You'll have worker revolts at places like Amazon or Google over the fact that companies are contracting with USG. While when we look at great power competition, you have China with an industry, especially in the AI sphere, that's an absolute lockstep with government. That's going to be an interesting and very difficult dynamic to bridge. There's been, I think there are some positive steps that USG has taken in that regard. DIUX is one, but that's going to be a real challenge when a lot of our competition with other great powers is technological. And the last thing I'll say is that, the information space. The last question that you asked really got into the information space when asking about alliances and friends. The 21st century and the social media information space and an information space that's very open and so allows in disinformation and manipulated information, it creates a lot of difficulties for democratic governments which try to act based on principles. You have this interesting opening and closing of the information environment at the same time. I don't think that the US government is set up in such a way where it's ready to compete in this information environment. So those are basically 6 different ways that I see us not quite being up to the challenges that we face.
Any other thoughts on that question, or we can move on? Okay. The next question also touches on a number of kind of things that came out. Some of it focused on kind of human capital and how best to harness the best of our nation, not just in the government but outside of it. And I'm going to begin with 2 quotes. Someone once said that World War I was the chemists' war, and that World War II was the physicists' war, and that the GWAT required anthropologists. And then I had a bright assessments officer that once worked with me proclaim, everything we need to know about terrorism has nothing to do with terrorism and everything to do with everything else. And we might substitute terrorism with competition in that statement. All to say that Americans' natural affinity for technological solutions may be mismatched to the conflicts born of the human condition that require deep and abiding understanding of the human terrain, social order, interest mapping, institutions, and increasingly, as you mentioned, David, narrative exchange and cognitive defense as a strategy formulation imperative. I believe that this applies equally to state and non-state actors, both the GWAT and strategic competition. So first, do you agree? And are we at risk of fielding advanced technologies without understanding what they represent in the strategic context of the infinite game mindset, the long-term strategic competition among great powers? And then finally, what disciplines and voices are lacking to be truly effective going forward? I've stunned you into silence.
Well, leave it to the professor to have a few opinions about disciplines. If this was Jeopardy, I would say, what is sociology and what is computational social science? Sociology, has a number of methods that are nested in the discipline, of course, that have evolved from anthropology, that have evolved from other disciplines. But key among them is the sort of simplicity of social network analysis and its value. Increasingly, we know that a lot of the challenges we faced today and tomorrow are, yes, they're layered in sort of state power, but they're also very much nested in private networks of private individuals, private organizations who are incentivized by kind of the rules that states set to behave in certain ways. Either they behave in concert with the rules, or they're sort of slipping past them, or they're trying to game them for their own interests. But it's really these networks of individuals and organizations increasingly outside the government sphere, outside the public sphere, that are much more influential in actual outcomes and sort of changing the ways in which nations, populations actually change over time. So you really need to have a really strong grip on social network analysis as an adjunct tool to other tools that you need to understand the rest of the world. Obviously, computational social science is super key. I don't think we have done enough in the United States to really invest in it. What does it get us? In some ways, a greater capacity for computational social science across the board, not just inside the government, but in the private sector, in the public sector, the nonprofit sector, is going to be key to kind of creating almost a meteorological weather metrical system for understanding the storms that are coming via our networked information environment. Not just social media, but the Internet of Things, you name it. Again, as I said, the attack surface is us. And if we don't have the tools to meet and understand ourselves and not just our adversaries or competitors or even our allies, we're really going to have a hard time getting to grips with accurately forecasting the threats ahead, but also sufficiently and I think impactfully responding to the challenges that we're wrestling with today.
Thank you. Vice Admiral Munsch, you mentioned in your opener the character of interaction and came down even to at a cultural level, and this seems to be important as you develop competition concepts there in your team. What are we missing? Are we? And I know I'm talking to a nuclear engineer, and I'm a STEM guy. I like technologies, but are we too focused on it without really understanding the character of interactions?
Yeah, Todd. I not necessarily by design, but I do have a foot in both worlds. My graduate work was in philosophy, politics, and economics. So I think a good leader has to do both, and I don't say that just because I've had the fortune of being able to cross over like that. But as we dive ever deeper into specialties, the need to have a generalist who can see things from a broader perspective and what the effects are of the more detailed work on the system as a whole are quite important. And we tend to weed out those people with the way we've built career paths now. And that then brings about this problem of who do we have left who can understand something as broad and varied as competition. Going back to your early remark about can you find a way to characterize wars as we advance from one to the other? Maybe a common ground there is that they become ever more sophisticated because adversaries are looking to add in advantages as new options become available to overcome what might have been problems in a prior conflict. And eventually, at a theoretical level, you aggregate everything that's possible to try to get to that advantage. And so, back to this need to have people that can act as generalists with that broad perspective, and yet still have a depth of understanding of the core specific areas. Again, probably an unusual type of person, but we do strive to do that to a degree in the armed forces.
Thank you. Gina, in your experience in the intelligence community, how are we developing the kind of sort of mindsets or disciplines that we need in the current era? And this may go even beyond the counterterrorism arena, which I think we've had 20 years to kind of get right. I hope we've got it right.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I mentioned in the very beginning about adaptation and just being non-static in your thinking, whether it's from the generalist perspective or a specific tactical area, always challenging your own conclusions and combining your expertise with expertise that maybe doesn't make any sense that they would be combined, and then creating new knowledge from that. I mean, that's sort of a core, at least from an analytic perspective, that's a core part of what we do, trying to drive new knowledge. But I found, I really found the answers already so, on track, and completely agree with everything that folks have said. But it's funny because as you all were talking, I was actually thinking about my class again last night. We talked about Sun Tzu, and know your enemy, know yourself, and not all challenges need to be met. We need to mitigate risks, not necessarily eliminate all threats. And I think what worries me about even the conversation earlier about changing our government again and organizational change and everything is we really need to more institutionally understand our government, our role in the world, and the limitations as well as the impact of what we put out there. And there's no institutional way that I'm aware of where we really do that across the government. Obviously, coming from the intelligence community, that is not our role. You know, our role is to understand the adversaries and the opportunities and things like that and the trends in the world. But it does seem that the national security apparatus of the United States really ought to know America and America's effect in the world before it starts taking on a lot of challenges. And I just don't, I think that is crucial before you go down the road of anything more specific.
And I think what you said really is necessary. It's this notion of a net assessment, understanding blue in the context of your threat, and the green, the environment, and actors and factors that are also contributing to the operational or strategic environment. And I think too often if we simply face a threat-based understanding of the environment, it forces a reactive strategy formulation as opposed to what you're suggesting of knowing yourself, our interests, our objectives, and then asking how does the threat frustrate our ability to achieve them. And I think we certainly had a lot of that, in the last 20 years. I'm going to pivot
Todd,
a bit.
before you go on. Could
yes,
I
please.
invoke the two-finger rule there to have a follow-on?
Absolutely, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to combine a few things that we've talked about here as an idea. One of the challenges in the government structure, and we talked about how we might organize, is that the NSC obviously works at a very high level, and they are tremendously tasked in their work hours. And so the ability to follow up on things is not always there, and it's just assigned to different departments, of course, to carry on. But conditions change over time, and that doesn't always result in a reconsideration. So that's one issue. Second thing is something Gina mentioned, that often innovation happens when you combine two things that haven't been combined before. And then David had mentioned startups within the government. And so there is an idea that's kind of floating around right now that could we create a structure that is sort of like NCTC-like, meaning that you take detailees from various parts of the government, bring them together in a structure, put them underneath the NSC staff to work more detailed things, and to follow up on actions as they go out and come back. Also to work together, combining different ideas. And then if they come up with something that might be effective, then spin it off as a startup and see where they can take it.
I really like that as a person that worked over 5 years at NCTC, and I know Gina's there now, and specifically in the Directorate of Strategic Operational Planning. So this is not the intelligence analysis folks; these are the strategists, and it is a unique model. It is a matrix model, as you said, that draws from across the interagency, brings all those instruments of power together in one place, because again, terrorism is about everything else. It's an understanding of economics and sociology and anthropology and all these things. And so all those instruments of power are brought together in NCTC somewhat effectively. It lacks under the legislation, the real directive teeth to maybe make it more effective, like you would see in a task force or a joint task force or an interagency task force. But nevertheless, it is a very interesting model, and one that I think might be duplicated. I think the fear I have is and what you described was I think gets away from this is we can task force our way or center of excellence our way out of every gray rhino or black swan, every vertical shock to the system, and increasingly they go on like the Pacific Ocean. The horizon just never ends with these things, and so is there something that is maybe again works under the NSC, does not have troops in the field, does not have budgets to defend. So it comes very dispassionately to the work of the nation, to whole of government thinking and action and strategy formulation and even intelligence work that may be quite effective. So I like what you're saying, and I think that convergence. I think there are models that are worth striking into. And then again, more generic than just simply a terrorism or COVID or whatever the species of gray rhino or vertical shock is, but something that is more at a resiliency or sustainability level of thinking. So I'm sorry to use a moderator's prerogative there, but you got me going. I've been thinking about this a little bit myself, obviously. So let me move on to a new line of questioning here. And this one has to do with, and several people have mentioned, I think Candace may have started this notion of attack surfaces, which is a hacker's term, a cyber term for how they looked at the attack surface they were looking to hack into. But there's an offense and a defensive side to an attack surface. Of course, now that metaphor is drawn and used for a lot of different purposes. But you could say that the GWAT could be referred to as the first war of globalization in the digital or information age. Two, incredible aspects or features of the current environment. And some aspects of war are as old as human conflict itself, and other characteristics are not easily dismissed as history repeating itself. I think that a strong case could be made that the transnational terrorism personified by the global jihadist movement, transnational crime, and even the Arab Spring would not have even been possible without the combined effects of globalization and the internet, or think of information technologies, the connectedness, the networks. So resistance to globalization has not dampened this. In fact, it seems to have superheated it. And so with this in mind, and drawing from the lessons we may have learned over the past 20 years in this first war of the information age and globalization, how might we cope with the exponential rise in interactive complexity between humans and the systems we create, combined with the diffusion of power that we've experienced away from nation states to actors? And how there's obviously been a corresponding expansion of the global attack surface, the things we must defend, and I think this goes both ways, as I mentioned. But how do we shore up the U.S. vulnerabilities in an expanding attack surface? So over to you for thoughts.
Todd, I love the way you ask questions. Right, like I don't think there's been an answerable question this entire panel, like at least not one where there is a clear right answer. And
I will discipline myself later.
No, don't take this as a criticism. It actually is about the highest compliment I could possibly pay. I think that part of exponential improvement comes from asking the right questions, and often they're questions that are unanswerable in the moment. It often can take, if you're asking the right question, it might take years to get the right answer. But once you do, it improves that sudden shot forward. So in this question that you're asking about the interaction between humans and the diffusion of power, I actually think, to me, it intersects with the previous question that you asked about what disciplines are missing. I think I was the only person who didn't take a cut at that question. And I did write down a couple of words on it. And the words I wrote down are cognitive warfare. And this ties in with what Gina said from Sun Tzu, know your enemy, know yourself. I think that actually today in 2021, knowing yourself, I would say is probably harder than it's ever been, right? The degree of human manipulability and the sheer amount of actors who are trying to understand our brain space, know us better than we know ourselves, and then manipulate us, it's much higher than it's ever been. It includes, governments, multiple foreign governments, extremist actors, companies trying to sell us things. We're easier to know and easier to manipulate than we've ever been. And even the way platforms are designed inherently manipulates us. Everyone should know about the dopamine effect, which comes from social media. The way that platforms like Facebook or Twitter will willfully hijack our neurotransmitters. I think that part of what to me, one thread that runs through every question that you asked, starting even with the very first question about alliances and friends, is building resilience. And I think resilience is often built at an individual level before you build it at a network level, before you build it at a community level. I think we're in a moment where human resilience vis-a-vis manipulability is at an all-time low. To me, that's the very first thing that I would think about. If to throw a question back at the question, because we're in a realm of kind of unanswerable questions. The question I'd throw back is, how do we make members of our public more resistant to the overarching attempts to manipulate them? And then question number two is, how do you make, let's not even try to scale it yet, but at a community level and scalable from there, how do you create that resiliency among people? And I think that would be where I'd start the question, start answering the question about humans and diffusion of power, because I think ultimately it's a question of manipulability. And I'm sure that we all agree that the answer isn't that the US government just has to become better at manipulating people than other actors. That is not a satisfactory answer. That is a Brave New World answer.
Anyone else want to bite at the apple?
I'd like to respond to something that David said, if I could, that I think is really interesting, actually. I mean, cognitive warfare is certainly, like, I think that one of the best frames for what we now, I think, face. But I was sort of, as you were talking, David, I was thinking about, the early age of television in the United States, when it was popular and kind of an obsession to try and get on a quiz show, right? And there was kind of like a furor to do crazy things that could be seen on TV, a million hula hoops, or eating a million hot dogs, whatever it was. And there's a parallel here that I think we haven't really quite kind of come to grips with, which is we often think about information, and its sort of role in shaping our cognitive responses as, our brain is being infected by, viral information. And that's the kind of main metaphor that we have been sort of using to understand manipulation, particularly from state actors like Russia and China, when it comes to social media. But increasingly, I think there's a whole branch of kind of scholars out there now, including myself and a few others, who's beginning to kind of recast the proposition, which is that there's a good deal of social capital to be gained from being part of the attention economy through a lucky gamble, a time on the quiz show, right? And I think a lot of the work ahead is changing the incentive structure of certainly our consumer marketplace for internet interaction, whether it's social media or other tools and platforms, is going to be really key. Changing, some of the ways in which companies, advertisers in particular, can trade up or down based on sort of micro-targeting of our, ethnic or, gender attributes or what have you. If we can work on changing that incentive structure and kind of de-incentivizing trying to gain social capital from, outlandish performance on digital platforms, we actually might be able to control a bit, or at least create those kind of resiliencies that you're talking about, David.
Can you all hear me? My computer has frozen up, age of COVID, and can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can.
Yeah, Todd, hear you fine.
Okay, I'm going to continue on, and thankfully I printed out some of this stuff so I can do this without my screen, and so please bear with me. I thank you and apologize for the technical difficulty, but if you can hear me, I think we're okay. No, thank you for that. And Gina, I think it looked like you were ready to respond as well. Did you want to have something to say about that one?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I thought, again, I have nothing to argue with the previous comments. I just have a very different way of framing, I think, this particular discussion. I have actually written a bit on identity resilience, and that precisely the challenge that we're facing today, where we have such a growth of micro-identity extremism around the world that is enabled, of course, by social media and instant communication. So I had a few thoughts, like in terms of how do we build that identity resilience? It clearly comes from mutual respect. There's just no other way. That's, again, right down to parenting from an individual to a national and international level. Mutual respect is the only way to guarantee identity resilience. And so, I'll set that aside for a moment, because my second point, as I've observed national and international security over the years and how often we look for stability or we raise the alarm at prospective instability. And I think in some ways we've been asking the wrong question, because it's really about authenticity of governance. When you have authenticity of governance, stability follows. And so when I look at the history of the world, up from the moon, I still see a world that is struggling, most of it, at different paces and different rates, with getting back to authenticity of their form of government, however they divide up power, from the legacy of 500 years of colonial imperialism. 75% of the world was at one point under the British Empire. And, I think I still see the global jihadist movement, and even to some of the domestic movements that you see in the United States, as a reaction to the evolution from, or departure from, the legacy of those colonial powers in the governments that were created when the empires left. So I know that's kind of scattered, but my point is, I don't think we get to stability and real endurance of government and governance until it's truly authentic. Now that becomes extremely challenging in a country like the United States, where we are built on an idea as opposed to a nationality. And we have so much diversity in this country, which brings me back to the need for mutual respect, so that someone else's identity is not a threat to your identity. You just respect that it's their identity, and you go on with your own. That's the only way the system can work, which really gets me to my last point. And again, as I said, I'm unapologetic about this, but I do look at national security very differently from a woman the gatherer perspective, as opposed to a man the hunter. And we talk so much about warfare and border integrity, and all of which are important to keeping America and Americans safe. But a lot of it comes back to this fundamental default belief that a nation state is defined by its monopoly on. I rather would like to see the legitimacy of a nation state defined by its ability to deliver equitable justice. If we had a different way of considering what a nation state is, of understanding what a government is supposed to deliver, of recognizing what security in your nation really is, I think a lot of the way we think about power and power competition, instability, conflict, warfare would change quite a bit. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
No, thank you, Gina. Spot on. And I'm particularly attracted to your reference, or probably the underserving, I think, of our understanding of the GWAT from the post-colonial geostrategic environment. It definitely was in many ways a response to some of that. I want to pivot to something several of you brought up, and Gina, you just weaved it a little bit into your response, but it's this notion of power, and power in the 21st century, and power simply defined as the ability to change a system. And I think what 9/11 did is forced us to confront a new rule set, a set of changes that frankly had been building for some time, but then came into stark relief on 9/11. And those rule sets were, really a product, like so many things in our thinking, a product of sort of the Cold War. And we had this notion that traditional monopolies on many of the instruments of power resided in nation states, most importantly, the information power. But that is clearly not true. This diffusion of power away from nation states to populations down to the individual level to non-state actors, think of NGOs, Doctors Without Borders. I mean, this is not necessarily an all malicious thing. In fact, it's quite benevolent in many, many cases. But through all that emerges this centricity of populations and the lessons of alliances, both supranational and subnational. And I think that the Chinese and the Russians fear this. You see this in their responses on how they, the distorted social contract that they have with their own populations. But how do we effectively reconcile the limits of U.S. power, this notion of control versus credible influence? How do we come to think about U.S. leadership in a rules-based liberal world order with a new understanding of the derivation, the application, and frankly, the measurement of power? Gina, coming to sort of your index or your measurements. Anyone want to take a stab at that? And I cannot see you, I'm sorry, so please just jump right in. Another too hard question, I think.
Okay,
No one.
Todd. I'll take a stab at it because you mentioned my name, and it also give my colleagues time to think about something better than what I'm about to say. But I think it is only maybe because of the globalization, and particularly that we have reached the digital age, that we are beginning to understand the power of influence as a power. I know we talked, I started off in the Cold War too, and obviously that was another influence competition. And I know it's part of, it is part, of course, of all conflict, but recognizing that what endures, going back to my authenticity statement, what endures is when you have that shared influence. When you have actually influenced another population, whether it's the neighbor next to you or the state next to you, and you now own the same ideas or the same set of ideas or intentions, that's what endures. You conquer a country, that's not going to do it. I always thought, as a kid, hiding under my desk, my father was in the Navy, so I grew up in a naval base, hiding under the desk for these drills because there was the threat of mutually assured destruction from the Soviet Union. It just didn't seem rational to me that the day after a nuclear attack, we were going to suddenly be communist. I figured, no, we would continue to fight back and still be a democracy, right? So you can control and outmight somebody or something for a period of time, but it's never going to last if you don't influence them. And again, have that population buy into the same, framework that you're thinking in. So when you talk about the power challenges in the future, because we have non-state actors now, and really government is going to be the last place to see its own irrelevance. We're gonna see it last. Everyone else recognizes the diffusion of power. I think it ultimately comes down to, if you have something, if what you're trying to influence, and I don't want to say what you're trying to sell, but if the narrative, the hope, the concept that you're trying to spread is respectful and good, I mean, if it's truly good, then it's going to carry. And so again, I think it comes back to, for America and trying to be the shining city on the hill, it's understanding we need to understand ourselves. We need to maybe refamiliarize ourselves with our goods, what we're really good at, what we, in what ways we do shine on that hill, and just get back in touch with that as we try to influence the global arena.
That is the centering of power as we as Americans should know it. So thank you, Gina. Listen, we're at the end of our time, and I regret that. If you could see me right now, you'd know that I am smiling from ear to ear. It has been a distinct pleasure having all of you with me on this panel, and I hope we've advanced the thinking a little bit. It's a journey, not a destination. Thank you all so much. Thanks to the University of South Florida, U.S. Central Command, our friends at NISA, and all that worked so hard to put this together. It's been a delight. Thank you all.
Todd, thanks to you and your panel. You've really set the stage for our final discussion. But before we get to that, let's take a short break. We'll see you all back here at 3 p.m.